Ayyappa Panikker's essay Towards an Indian Theory of Translation discusses the ways in which translation was conceptualized in pre-colonial India and how the various terms associated with translation and other forms of rewriting can be analyzed to understand the current practice of translation and other forms of rewriting. One of the first things that one notices about translation in ancient India, in fact, ancient and medieval India. So this situation prevailed till the beginning of the colonial period, before the colonial intervention. So what one notices is that translation was not understood as a literal word-by-word rendering of the original from the source language to the target language. This was a kind of concept which existed in the West, largely in the West, I would say. But of course, Ayyappa Panikker also doesn't fail to mention that the practice of free, more or less free rewriting or rendering was also prevalent in some European cultures, especially in the rendering of the classical epics. The way in which Homer's epics were rendered into the various national languages of Europe paralleled the kind of rewriting as translation of the Indian epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata, I would say. But one important difference in translation in India is here pointed out. That is, in the case of treatises or knowledge texts, rather than literary texts, the practice was, or the objective was, for faithful translations, to keep close to the original text. So works on astronomy, astrology, medicine, economics, political science. One can immediately recall Ashtanga Hridaya, the treatise on medicine, and Arthashastra or Kaudilya, the treatise on economics and politics, polity, which were translated as faithfully as possible. One had to see to it that not a single important points of discussion is distorted. They had to be faithfully reproduced in translation. Whereas for literary texts, the guiding principle was imaginative recreation, recreating the text, recreating the original text in the translators or rewriters' own way. Because most of these rewriters were not called translators. So one would hesitate to call Eluthachan a translator of the Ramayana into Malayalam. His Ramayana is in many ways an original text in its own right. Ayyappa Panikker notes that variations or deviations from the original were not only tolerated but also encouraged, because these were happening more or less according to the notion of culture broadly within the same culture, or broadly within contiguous cultures which were in close association, languages and cultures which were in close association with each other. Although all of India's literatures are rich in translations and other kinds of rewritings, very little has been said about translation in India's aesthetics, in classical Indian aesthetics. So there is no work which can be compared to the grammar of Panini or the dramaturgy of Bharata, Bharata, who wrote on the art of drama, or any other writer who wrote on literature, Ananda Vardhana, or Kundaga, or Bhamaha, any of those great aestheticians of ancient India had no contemporaries who wrote about translation. Translation was not theorized at all. Perhaps translation was considered too unimportant to be theorized. Ayyappa Panikker finds another reason for this very surprising lack of theorization on translation. Unlike the translation of the Bible, which was done with a clear missionary objective and which therefore required clear guidelines on translation, the translation of the Ramayana and Mahabharata or any other text, secular or religious, did not have such a clear objective. So if you take the translations of the Bible done by the American Bible Society or other missionary organizations, one finds that there is a good amount of theorization, the setting up of guidelines for translation. One especially remembers Eugene A. Nider's guidelines or specifications on translation, which he tried to implement in his own way as the head of a mission for translating the Bible. So his book, for instance, the Theory and Practice of Translation, one of the most important works on translation written in the 20th century, lays down clear rules on translation. So ancient Indian aesthetics did not have such a need for setting up guidelines for translation. However, there are scattered instances of reflections on translation and other forms of rewriting in Sanskrit and Tamil. If we, Ayyappa Panikker says, if we put together these scattered reflections or scattered observations on translation and other forms of rewriting, we may perhaps be able to put together what can be roughly called an Indian theory of translation and rewriting. So for this purpose, Ayyappa Panikker examines some of the terms current in ancient Sanskrit literature and criticism. So for instance, a term like vivarta. Vivarta would mean change, alteration. So one can say the text is altered in translation. Paribhasha, another term which is also currently used in describing translation, would mean speech, discourse, general rule, etc. And whereas Bhashandaram would indicate the switching over not only into another language but also into another dialect or another style of the same language. Anuvad, the term currently used in Hindi for translation, would indicate repetition or a repetitive way of explanation. In other words, saying what has already been said, saying it again. So we have seen that none of these terms exactly stand for translation as it is understood in the West. This would mean that in ancient and medieval India, a good deal of creative deviance was tolerated. In fact, perhaps looked upon as the ideal, which is why an umbrella term, a term which covers translation in all its various forms, rewriting in all its various forms, did not exist in ancient and medieval India. There are some more interesting terms. For example, anukriti or imitation. or an artha kriya, which would mean enacted meaning, or the transformation of a text in performance. Roughly, something which can roughly be used to refer to intersemiotic translation, the dramatization of a novel, or the filming of a literary text, what is today known as adaptation of a novel into cinema. All these can perhaps be described as arthakriya, or the coming alive of a text in performance. Vyakti vivegam can perhaps be understood as the deviation deviation that is made to a text, that is operated upon a text by the rewriter or translator. Similarly, the Dravidian term ullure, indicating an inner speech or subtextual meaning, the subtle modulation of the antecedent text in rewriting, whereby the inner or the what is implied in the original is brought out into the open. What is covert becomes overt. One can understand the term in that way. Ayyappa Panikker also tries to find out the kind of intertextual relationship that exists between the original text or the antecedent text and the translation or the rewriting. Ayyappa Panikker talks about what he calls an ur text, or a proto-text, the text of a literary work that exists in the collective consciousness of the people, which the first writer turns into a written text, into a proper text, and the rewriter rewrites it. So, Ramayana is probably a collection of stories, myths, legends, which are put together into a single text, which are given a thread as a single text by both Valmiki and the unknown author of the Adhyatma Ramayana. So, one can think of the ur text, or the text which is not actually available as a text, but which exists in the collective unconscious of a people, being written in two different ways into Valmiki Ramayana and Adhyatma Ramayana. Okay. Now, these two texts can be together or singly taken as the antecedent text or the original from which the various Ramayanas in India's regional languages have been written. Valmiki's Ramayana, Eluthachan's Ramayana in Malayalam, Krittivas Oja's Ramayana in Oriya, Kamba's Ramayana in Tamil, Tulasidasa's Ramayana in Hindi, etc. All these Ramayanas springing from the one or more forms of Ramayana, which were themselves rewritten or textualized from the Ur Ramayana, or the Proto Ramayana, which instead of existing as a text, existed in the collective consciousness of the people. The kind of rendering or rewriting which has occurred in the translation of Ramayana into India's Valmiki Ramayana into India's regional languages can be best understood by looking at the way Eluthachan changed the profile of Rama in his Ramayanam, Kilipattam. In Valmiki's Ramayana, Rama is only a paragon of humanity, Purushottama, the ideal man. Whereas in Eluthachan's Ramayanam, Rama becomes virtually a god, a deity, somebody to be venerated and admired, somebody whose very name triggers of an ecstasy of devotion. The Tamil term Ullure would signify how the inner meaning, which is latent in the text, is brought out in a rendering. The inner speech, what is unheard, what lies beneath the surface, what is perhaps a subtext in the original, is brought out into the open. Unlike in the West, few people used to be bothered about the authenticity or the faithfulness of these renderings. So these renderings refer not only to the translations of apparently religious texts like Ramayana, but also to various secular texts, the plays of Kalidasa, the poems of the poem Bhavabodhi's Uttara Ramacharita, and various works in Sanskrit written during the ancient and medieval period, which were freely rendered into India's regional languages. What is important was not authenticity or faithfulness, but the creativity of the writer. The creativity of the writer who, in fact, produced a work of his own. They are original works. They are often considered, not often, perhaps always considered, original works for which the authors are given credit. They are not translators. They are not considered rewriters or secondary authors. Their position is secure as original authors. This is a vital difference in the concept of translation or rewriting in India and in the West. Renderings of Ramayana often ignored the differences in length between the original or antecedent text and the rewriting or the translation. So that in many instances, for instance, Valmiki Ramayana has 400 lines in the first canto, which is reduced to 170 lines in Kannasha Ramayana, the translation of Ramayana by Kannasha Panikker. And Tulsidas' Ramacharitmanas, which is the Hindi, which is the canonized Hindi translation of the Ramayana, also takes such a liberty with the original text. The intertextual relationship between the original and the translation can be understood in a diagrammatic representation made by Ayyappa Panikker. There is a long line at the ends of which are literal paraphrase and creative translation. Literal paraphrase at the left, on the left, and creative translation on the right. So a literal paraphrase would imply a faithful translation, a completely faithful translation, without any deviation, without any departure from the original. Now this is impossible. Any translation would deviate at least a little, marginally from the original. So the no translation or rewriting would lie on the extreme left end of this line. On the other hand, a complete creative translation is also not possible because the rewriting or translation has to have some intertextual relationship with the original. At least the creative rewriting or rendering must be shown as having been launched from the original or antecedent text. So all translations or rewritings lie somewhere on this line between the two ends, neither at the extreme left end nor at the extreme right end. So the most important thing in rewriting or translation in India is not faithfulness or equivalence, but intertextuality, the ways in which the rewriting is intertextually related to the antecedent text or the original, how this relationship is formulated. Okay, and if we go back to what Ayyappa Panikker said about the Ur text, a text which only exists in popular imagination, a text which exists in the collective consciousness of the people. We would see that this is a kind of progression or movement from folk literature to classical literature. What existed as oral narratives, what existed as legends, myths, and stories orally transmitted here are codified into a written text. Something which happened in Greece too, where Homer's epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, also codified or also textualized what existed as ur-texts in the collective consciousness of the Greek people. Ayyappa Panikker also looks at counter texts of rewritings or translations, not translations but rather rewritings, complete, a total rejection of the ideological positions taken by the original text. For example, a poem called Ravanayana by Pallat Raman, a Malayalam poet who wrote this poem in the 1930s. A poem which is a counter text to both Valmiki's Ramayana and Ezhuthachan's Ramayana. A text which valorizes Ravana instead of Rama, which makes Ravana the hero of the poem. This is a counter text, a text which goes against the basic ideological position taken by both Valmiki and Ezhuthachan. So this raises the question of how much of freedom can a translator take? Can Ravanayana be described as a translation or a free rendering or a rewriting or a deliberate political rewriting of Ramayana? This is a question which Ayyappa Panikker raises. Similarly, we have a text by Shashi Tharoor, a novel by Shashi Tharoor which is called The Great Indian Novel. This is a parody of the Mahabharata, we know, in which characters from modern Indian life, contemporary Indian society are substituted for the epic characters in Mahabharata. So this is also a counter text. One can call this a counter text. So one can say that Ayyappa Panikker's essay raises important questions about the differences between the conceptualization of translation in the West and in India. And it sort of elevates intertextuality to the level of the most important principle in translation or rewriting, rather than equivalence or faithfulness. And it is the way in which the intertextual relationship between the original and translation, or the antecedent text and rewriting, is formulated, that gives us a good idea about the process of translation or rewriting. So all these texts, both the ones in ancient and medieval India, and also modern texts like Ravanayana and the Great Indian Novel, they give us an insight into the possibility of formulating an Indian theory of